Good morning. I'm so happy to see you on this Lord's Day. A little bit rainy out there, but not too bad. Glad that you made it. We're going to be looking at the book of Isaiah, of course. That's what this class is, and we're going to be looking at a really large section. I hope that you can listen quickly because we're going to have to cover a lot, and we're going to really be taking a look at mostly chapter 13 through, we're sort of going to look at 27 through 27. This is still, remember, the first part of Isaiah. Isaiah breaks down into two parts. So you got the first 39. Just think of it, it's just like the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So Isaiah has 66 chapters, like the Bible has 66 books. The first section is the first 39 chapters, just like the Old Testament has 39 books. And the last section, 27 chapters, just like the New Testament has 27 books. It is an amazing division there. So chapter 40 through 66 is what we sort of call the book of comfort. So we're looking today still in that first part of the book, which is really Isaiah is, in this section that we examine today, he's looking at, he's pronouncing woes upon the different nations and groups that have set themselves against the people of God. Now, a couple of things that I want to give you as a sort of a precursor to what I'm going to say, some background things that we have to understand. One is just about what we call theodicy, the justice of God. And understand this principle, that God might raise up someone, like an enemy nation, to his people and use that army, those rulers, to chastise, to discipline his people. In this case, Isaiah is telling them they're going to be taken into exile. And God raises up enemies to do that. But remember, even the view of God's sovereignty over humanity in the scriptures never absolves humanity of responsibility. So just because God has ordained and willed certain things are going to happen, Isaiah says that like Babylon and Assyria and Persia and these enemy nations that are going to come against God's people, and God's doing that. God says in advance it's going to happen. And yet God also says, I'm holding you responsible for what you do to my people. And God punishes them. So some people don't understand that. In fact, they're very uncomfortable with it. That, well, how? And this is exactly, if you read Romans 9, this is the argument that Paul sort of pulls up. Well, how can he find fault with anybody? Because then who has resisted his will? And here's Paul's brilliant answer to that. He just says, who are you to ask that question? And that's it. That's Paul's answer to it. He doesn't work it out for us. It's not intellectually satisfying, but it's the truth. Paul says, nay, but O man, I remember in the King James here, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? So he says, you are God's creation, and you have no right to sit in moral judgment on God. If God purposes to raise up a nation like Babylon or Assyria to then chastise his people, he has the right to do that, and he has the right to judge those that have done it. So you have to understand the will of God almost on two different levels. One is what we would call the revealed will of God. That is clearly his do this and don't do that. The revealed will of God is his moral will, his instruction through, back then, the prophets. Now through his word, he tells us what to do, what not to do, and we're accountable to do that. But you have then the secret will of God. These are the things that God does not reveal, but God is moving and orchestrating in history. And that involves things like raising up nations and putting down nations, and it does not change our moral responsibility. You have to understand that. So you have to look through this grid at Isaiah. Isaiah is telling us God is sovereign, and God is always, his ultimate purpose is to bring himself glory And he's doing that primarily through redeeming a people to himself, and he's doing that through his son, Jesus Christ. So in order to bring himself glory, ultimately, through redeeming a people, God works the affairs, the events of world history to fulfill that purpose. And he does that through his sovereign will, in which he, as the Bible says, he holds the heart of the king in his hands and he turns it wherever he wants it to go. And so as Isaiah is prophesying to these nations, the same prophet who says that here's what the nations are going to do, then also prophesies against those nations and says, and boy, you're going to pay for it. God's going to hold you accountable, and you're going to be punished for what you've done to his chosen people. So that's one thing. The other thing I want you to think about is the way Isaiah has to prophesy, and he's prophesying about things that we know now, sitting here on this side of Calvary and the empty tomb, that he was talking about some things that were just 20 years out in the distance. He was talking about some things that were about 600 years out in the distance. He was talking about some things that are 3,000 years out in the distance or more. We don't know when Jesus is going to come back. We don't know when, so we don't know that date. We don't know how far out in advance those things were. So think about how would a prophet do that? Let's just put it in our context today. This would not happen. I believe in the sufficiency of Scripture. I think God has revealed everything we need to know in His Word. But let's imagine, just for the sake of illustration, that I am a prophet and that God gives me specific revelation about things that are going to happen to America in 20 years and in 200 years and in 2,000 years. And I'm to prophesy about those. Now, we could probably understand any prophecy about things that are going to happen 20 years down the road. The main players probably won't change a whole lot. We might be surprised. Like if I prophesied that the Philippines is going to be a major world power, that would be shocking. But there are things today that, like, if you told me 20 years ago the power of computing that we'd all have on our phones right now, I'd have said, yeah, and the guy that's on The Apprentice will be president of the United States. So we've all been shocked by the development of things that we take for granted today, 20 years ago even. Just think about in my lifetime, the stuff that's changed. If you told me when I was a little kid that in the future children won't be allowed to sleep up in the back window of their parents' car, I'd have said, what? That's the best place for a kid to sleep, in the car. How many of you ever slept up in the back window of a car, man? I mean, that's unthinkable now. You go to jail for that now, and with good reason, we understand it. But man, when I was a kid, a lot of times I slept all up the Western Kentucky Parkway, the Bluegrass Parkway, from West Kentucky to Lexington, up in the back window of my dad's car. And now that's just unthinkable. Things have changed a lot even in our lifetime. So when Isaiah prophesies some things, he's prophesying the people in Israel would know the main players that he's talking about for those things that are 20 years down the road. But then he's talking about some regions that it was sort of unthinkable that they would even be a world power, like Greece. There's nobody thinking there's going to be a Greek empire at the time of Isaiah. Alexander the Great, that's just, the Greeks weren't a world power. They just weren't doing that. And that would be shocking to think that there's going to be a Greek who's going to conquer the world. And that would have seemed really, really strange. And so, like Daniel prophesies the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, and he portrays it by an animal, and so that that view of the future is used metaphorically, and so Isaiah is going to do that. But then if he's prophesying stuff that's 2,000 years down the road, way down the road, like the return of Christ, when Isaiah prophesied, Jesus hadn't even come the first time, the Messiah hadn't come the first time. So all of this, if you heard Isaiah prophesy, all that's jumbled together. So he's talking about some of the players, Yeah, we know Damascus. Damascus is right up there to our northeast, and we know who they are, and you're telling me they're gonna come against us. Okay, that made sense. But then there are other things like the wilderness by the sea, the desert by the sea. Well, who's that? Who's the desert by the sea? And to prophesy these things, Isaiah, this book is the most highly stylized literary book in the Old Testament. There's no other poetry like Isaiah. It is phenomenal. And he uses lots of word plays. And they don't even translate into English. You don't know that the word for evening is a whole lot like the word Arabia. You don't know that the word silence, Duma, is also the name for a place in a wordplay for Edom. We just don't pick up on this. So there's some things that are going on a literary level that we don't even see in English, but we can discern the meaning clearly enough without catching every little wordplay. But this is what I want us to look at, and we're going to see these prophecies that Isaiah is making against the nations. So we call this, these are the burdens of Isaiah. Now last week we looked at chapters 8, 9, and 10 specifically, and the prophecies that Isaiah gives there of the coming of the Messiah. And so look at Isaiah 8. And of course this, remember in chapter 9, we looked at this closely last week, the passage about that we often quote at Christmas: unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, the government shall be upon his shoulder. So there we have, all right, even in that prophecy, what's Isaiah looking at? He's looking at two things. He's looking at what's going to happen a few hundred years later, just about 700 and change years later, when Jesus is born. But the government will be upon his shoulders, meaning he's David's greater son. He's going to reign and rule on the throne of David. Is Jesus now the son of David? Yes, and he was when he came the first time. And is the throne of David his? Yes, that's the case Matthew makes in the Gospel of Matthew, showing us the descent from David to Jesus, that Jesus is the rightful heir to the throne, and that he's the king of the Jews, that he's the king of kings. But do we physically see Jesus reigning on that throne, sitting on the throne, occupying the throne, ruling the nations? No, not yet. It's true. It is a settled fact that Jesus reigns in heaven, and yet he's not yet brought that rule out into the open in the cosmos. He's ruling and reigning in the hearts of his people. He's overcome us. He's defeated Satan already. I'm going to talk about this in the sermon in Ephesians 6, that Satan has already been defeated. I mean, his defeat has been done, but he's still dangerous. So he's defeated, but he's still dangerous. So sort of just think about after, the shock and awe invasion of Iraq, and Saddam was gone, but you could still get shot, right? It was still a dangerous place to be because there were still enemies there. The end result was absolutely assured that his army's going to be completely defeated, but it was still dangerous. And that's the way it is today, that Satan has been defeated. Jesus said, I beheld Satan cast out of, I beheld Satan fall from heaven like lightning. And so that's been done, but he's still dangerous. He's still the prince of the power of the air. He's still at work and loose. And so Isaiah is looking at both things. He's looking at the first coming of Jesus, and Jesus is born the king, and he does rule and reign, but then the open reign of Christ is yet to come. That's why we talk about the already not yet aspect of eschatology, that we believe in an eschatology that is, yes, it is already fulfilled, but not yet. There's still more. It's like the overlap of two ages, the present evil age and the age to come. And you and I live in the age to come, but man, here we are in this present evil age as well. So this is the tension. And Isaiah prophesies from, if you're sitting there listening to Isaiah as he preaches, you're seeing this as one thing. You and I on this side of the cross, and with the full revelation of God in the Word, we know it's not one thing. Jesus comes twice. He comes the first time a baby in a manger, the second time a conqueror on a white horse. But he's the same Jesus, and he's ruling and reigning. So we're going to walk through the burdens of the nations. Now the ESV translates it an oracle, but it's the word for burden, and Isaiah has these burdens. He delivers these sermons against the nations. And the first one is the longest and most extended oracle or burden against the nation. And it begins in chapter 8 and it goes all the way down through chapter 14. It's the burden against, or the burden of Babylon. So chapters 8 through 14, verse 27 is the burden of Babylon. And this is where God, remember, gives the sign of, in chapter 7, he gave the sign of the virgin that would conceive, the young maid that would conceive in the Old Testament. And Isaiah's wife, the prophetess, bears Hershael, and that is the sign to Ahaz that God is going to be with his people. And this child is going to be born. He uses that as a window on the future birth of the Messiah. And yet, God's going to judge. Remember in chapter 9, at verse 8, he turns from this comforting message about the birth of the child to a word against Jacob, and it will fall on Israel, and all the people will know. And so here's this message of judgment. And remember how we saw several times, if you look at the end of verse 12, for all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. So God is saying over and over. He says it again in verse 17, verse 21, in chapter 10, verse 4. For all this his anger has not turned away, and his hand is stretched out still. So he has this judgment is coming. And throughout these chapters, Isaiah is going back and forth between giving comfort. There's going to be a remnant that will return. In chapter 10, he talks about that in verse 20. In that day, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on the Lord. So see, here's the thing, is that Ahaz is wanting to enter into a political alliance with the very nation, Assyria, that's going to attack, and that God's using to punish them. And God tells Ahaz through Isaiah, don't do that. And God is warning them that I'm going to punish you through them. But he says the day will come, you'll no longer lean on the one who struck you, but you'll lean on the Lord. And so again here, mixed in with this message of judgment is a message of comfort. You just see this over and over, all the way through chapter 14. And he specifically, he mixes in messianic references in chapter 11, verse 10. I want you to note that in that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a sign, a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. And so you get both things, the judgment of God and the deliverance of God. Now, where is that most perfectly expressed? Well, it's this phrase that you see the prophets use over and over and over, the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord will be, and sometimes you'll see the day of the Lord described as this awful thing, this terrible judgment that's going to fall. And some of the prophets say, don't think that the day of the Lord's going to be a good thing, because for you it's not a good thing. And that's true. But also the day of the Lord, well, that's going to come, and a child's going to play on the hole of a poisonous snake, and the lion and the lamb are going to lie down together. It's a day of peace and reconciliation and restoration. And this is what you need to see, is that both things are true. The day of the Lord means a day of judgment and a day of restoration. But it totally depends on whether or not you're in God's Son, whether you're in Christ, whether or not you've come to him through his Son and accepted his Messiah. So for those that have rejected him, Jew or Gentile, they're going to be rejected. It's going to be a day of judgment. And for those that have come to him through his Son, Jew or Gentile, those that are the true seed of Abraham, they're going to be saved. It's going to be a day of peace. And this is the case that Isaiah is making over and over. If every Jew was saved simply because they were a Jew, none of this would make sense, right? Why would Isaiah even prophesy? His message would be, you're fine no matter what, just because you're a descendant of Abraham. You're going to be okay. That's not at all what he's saying. He's prophesying to his people, and he's telling them that many of you are going to die. You're going to be destroyed. Many of you have left the Lord. And who's going to be saved? He uses this word over and over, a remnant, a remnant. There's just a small remnant. Think of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul uses that. We look back at the Israelites coming up out of Egypt, and he says, don't you know that all of our fathers brought up out of Egypt, they passed through the sea and the cloud, and they all, and he uses this word all, I think 6 times in that passage, they all were baptized in the sea and the cloud. They all ate that spiritual food. They all drank from that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ, and he uses that all. And then he says, but with the majority of them, God was not pleased, and they were scattered in the wilderness. And so he says, therefore, in his conclusion down there in verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 10 is, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. I mean, this is Paul's warning that it is possible for you to, on the outside, have everything right, all. And yet, to die lost. And this, a lot of times I've been interviewed on radio or TV, and they'll ask the question, are you saying that people like Jews and Muslims are going to hell? And I have a standard answer to that. I said, what I'm saying is Baptists are going to hell if they've not put their faith and trust in Jesus. It's not an ethnic message. It's a message of the gospel. There's only one way to come to God, and it's through his Son, Jesus Christ. That's the irrefutable message of the New Testament. And this is what Paul says to his brethren. I mean, listen to the anguish in Paul. He says, I could wish myself accursed for the sake of my brethren. I would be willing to be damned and separated from Christ if it would mean the salvation of my brothers according to the flesh, the Jews. Again, that statement makes no sense if anybody's going to heaven simply by virtue of their ethnicity. And so no one is. This is a matter of personal faith in Christ. And so Isaiah is mixing this message. The day of the Lord is a day of comfort for those that have come to God through his Messiah. It's a day of judgment for those that have not. And that's true of Israel as much as it's true of Assyria. And so that message goes down. It's primarily against Babylon, chapter 8, but it really starts in chapter 13, the oracle or the burden concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. And look how many times he mentions the day of the Lord in chapter 13, verse 6. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. Verse 9, behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. Verse 13, therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. And so you see this description of the day of the Lord. Now, the first part of chapter 14, again, Isaiah gives this word of comfort that there's going to be a remnant saved. Paul tells us that same thing in the book of Romans in chapters 9, 10, and 11 as he walks through this very issue. And he says in chapter 11, all Israel will be saved. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. And in what way? Well, that there's always a remnant, that in every generation, there are physical descendants of Abraham who accept the Messiah, Jesus the Messiah, as Lord and Savior. It very well may be also that at the return of Christ, that there's a great turning of the Jewish people to Christ. But make no mistake about it, the Bible is clear that there has to be a turning to Christ. There's no other way to be saved. You're not going to be saved by offering sacrifices in a third temple, and they're not going to be saved simply because they're descendants of Abraham. They're going to be saved only by turning to Jesus Christ. That's true for Jew, Muslim, nominal Christians. It's true for everybody. And there's a comfort in this, that God preserves a remnant. And he prophesies in chapter 14, the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. Now, let me just read that verse again, and let me ask you, when is that fulfilled? So this is a debate among good, conservative, Bible-believing people. There are some that see that is Isaiah prophesying what's going to happen at the end of the exile. That when Cyrus the Great decrees that the Israelites, the Jews can go back to their land, that remnant does go back to the land. And by the way, we know that's true, that happened. And others go with them. There are Gentiles that come to see the Lord as the one true God. We know that happened. We know that Jesus marvels at the faith of Gentiles during his earthly ministry. But there are some who see in Isaiah 14 there also a reference to what's happened in our lifetime, the return of the Jews to a Jewish homeland in the modern nation of Israel. So this is a debatable thing. Here's what I know. I know it referred to the first return after the exile. I personally don't think that's talking about what's happened in our lifetime, but I don't know. I might get to heaven and find out I was wrong. But I know it at least referred to what happened after Cyrus the Great. And through that remnant returning to the land, of course, this puts the Jews back in Israel, and then of course, Jesus the Messiah is born. So I know that ultimately, the greatest fulfillment of this is it's about Jesus, the Messiah, coming through that remnant. And this much I know. And he prophesies, beginning in verse 3, that this remnant is going to be the destruction of Babylon, that it taunts Babylon. Now, I want to tell you that here's another debate with Isaiah 14. And I will put myself squarely outside of what you've probably heard your whole life. So if you read verse 12, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to God. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. All right, now, who's that talking about? Who do you think it's talking about? Huh? Good. All right. I want you to say it. I'm not going to chastise you for saying it. Satan, right? How many of you have heard that's talking about Satan? All right. I'm just going to ask you, do you see anywhere, is there anything in there that says that he's talking about Satan? Now, there is one thing, if you're using a King James Bible, and it's the word, or if you're using an ESV, you see that phrase, day star? It literally means shining one. In the King James Bible, that's translated Lucifer. And actually, it's not translated. So here's the story. So one of my heroes, a guy named Jerome, I like him by his Greek name, Hieronymus. Those of you who have been to Israel with me, the place I hate the most in Israel is, Taylor, my apologies to you, it's Bethlehem. And Taylor spent a good deal of time over there teaching in Bethlehem and has a love for the people. I'm not talking about the people, but I am talking the Church of the Nativity. If I never see the Church of the Nativity again, I'd be fine with that. But when I take tours to Israel, you always have to go and let people be disappointed for themselves. Because you can't go to Israel and not go see where Jesus was born. And if you go see where Jesus was born, you go, that was awful. With a few exceptions. I think somebody told me last time they actually liked it. But it doesn't feel anything like a manger. Literally, it's the most, people are pushing and crowding and cutting in front of each other, and it's awful. It's just awful. I hate going there. But when you come out, after you see this place where they say Jesus was born, and lots of Orthodox people there from Europe and weeping and everything else, and then you go on, pass on out, and when we go back out to what's called Manger Square, there's a statue out in a courtyard where we stop and sort of debrief about the disappointment we all just felt. And that, it says Hieronymus on it. It uses his Greek name, and that's Jerome. And in the 4th century A.D., Jerome holed up there at the Church of the Nativity and translated the Bible into Latin. And that Bible is called the Vulgate. And it, for centuries, it was the Bible. The Catholic Church used it. And this is how Latin Mass and all that came, because Jerome's Bible, the Vulgate, written in Latin, became basically the Bible. Only educated. Remember, people didn't have Bibles in their homes. People had to go to priests and all to hear the Bible, and they did it in Latin. And the Latin word for shining one is Lucifer. And Jerome, Hieronymus, translated it as Lucifer. It's not a proper name. That's actually a participle, and it just means shining one, the shining one. But over the course of time, people started capitalizing that, and they used it as a name for the devil. Every one of you have heard the name Lucifer. It's used in movies and popular, horror films and all that stuff. That's not really a name of the devil. It's not ever really a name of Satan. It's just the Latin translation of this word from Hebrew. And when they started translating the Bible into English, like in Tyndale and in the King James Version, they didn't translate that word into English. They just kept it and turned it, put a capital L on the front. And this popular notion came out that this is talking about the devil. And there's just no evidence of that. Here's what we know. We know that he's talking about the king of Babylon. That, that you have raised yourself up, but you're going to be cut down. This is Isaiah's prophecy against Babylon. Now, again, some people say, yeah, I know that its primary reference is about the king of Babylon, but I think it also means its greater reference is to Satan. Well, I just answer that. Well, how do you know that? And what people do is use circular reasoning. Well, this has to be talking about the devil because we know that the devil fell from heaven and this is, it was like this. Well, how do we know this? Well, because it says it right there. And it's circular reasoning. We don't know a lot about Satan's origins. The Bible doesn't tell us. And I might get to heaven and find out that it was very much like this in Isaiah 14, but it might have been some very, very different way. We don't know. We know Satan fell, but this description is what the text tells us for sure is that this is about the king of Babylon. This is a prophecy about the future. It's not a statement about the past. This is Isaiah looking into the future, what's going to happen to Babylon. This is not Isaiah saying, let me tell you where Satan comes from and how that happened. And there's no suggestion in the text that that's what it's about. So, folks here at Buck Run, you know what I've taught you for years and years. Context is everything. Context is everything. And the context of this passage is clearly about Babylon. And so, I'm just saying we better be very careful saying the text means something that the text itself doesn't claim to mean. And even though it's one of those things, there's a whole category of things that we've all heard this, and we've heard it a long time, and we've heard it multiple times. But just because you've heard it a long time and you've heard it over and over does not mean it's true. I just appeal to the text. Well, what does the text say? Here's what I know it means. I know this is a prophecy for the future from Isaiah's point about the king of Babylon. And he gives then an oracle concerning Assyria. So the oracle against Babylon goes from chapter 13, verse 1 down through verse 27 of chapter 14. And then beginning with verse 28 through the rest of the chapter, you have an oracle against Philistia. So Philistia, by the way, that's where, you heard of Philistines. That's where they came from. And so they were a seafaring people, and they lived just to the north of Israel. Like when Jesus goes way up north and he meets the Syro-Phoenician woman. So Phoenicia, Philistia, those are corruptions of the same word. That's just to the north. So modern day Lebanon would be Philistia. And they had come and settled into the land of Canaan, and they were constantly a problem for the people of God. The Philistines, Goliath, remember, is a Philistine, and he fights for the Philistines, and David has to defeat the Philistines, but they're never finally defeated because they have pockets of areas all over the land of Israel where they lived. And so now here's an oracle or bird concerning Philistia, verses 28 through 32. And then chapter 15, all the way down, so 15:1 all the way down through 16:14. So all of 15 and 16 is the burden of Moab. Moab is like modern day Jordan. So it's on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. Those mountains of Jordan are over in there, Moab, and so the Moabites were constantly oppressing and fighting the people of God, and Isaiah's prophesying what's going to happen to them. All the way down in 15 and 16, you have this this incredible prophecy. Now, notice each of these prophecies start with, usually they start with a prosaic statement, an oracle concerning Philistia. And then he launches into poetry. And at the end of chapter 16, he goes back into prose. Verse 13, this is the word that the Lord spoke concerning Moab in the past. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, in 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt in spite of all his great multitude, and those who remain will be very few and feeble. So God says, I'm going to wipe them out. There are going to be a few weak, feeble folk that aren't considered worthy of being taken captive. They don't do anybody any good, and they're going to be left there. But that's how bad the area is going to get and be. And then chapter 17 is the burden of Damascus, and it goes chapter 17 down through all of chapter 18, which is just a few verses. So this is the burden against Damascus. Remember, Damascus is to the northeast of Israel, modern-day Syria, and they have oppressed God's people. So notice how he talks about the day of the Lord. So he's prophesying the fall of Damascus. And in the context of that, he talks about in verse 4 of chapter 17, in that day, the glory of Jacob will be brought low. Verse 7, in that day, a man will look to his maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. Verse 9, in that day, their strong cities will be like the deserted places of the wooded heights on the hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. So here, the prophets see the day of the Lord as this day of God's consuming fire, God's wrath as destroying the enemies of God's people. And Damascus is one of the great centers of oppression of God's people. Chapter 19 and 20 are about the burden of Egypt. Here it begins an oracle concerning Egypt. And look at the poetic description. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. And I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight each against another, and each against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. So here, God is going to come. He's going to turn the Egyptians against one another. By the way, you might know that Egypt, in Hebrew, the word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, is a plural word. Egypt was always, they're spoken of in the plural because it's like sort of the land of between the rivers. So the Nile Delta sort of divides Egypt. And it's always spoken of in the plural. And so Isaiah is playing on this. Yeah, they're plural. They're going to turn on each other. The two kingdoms of Egypt will turn on each other, the two sides of the Nile. All of that is Isaiah's poetic wordplay. And now, so if you think of these burdens, these oracles against the nations, they come in 3 cycles. And we've just looked at the first cycle. So think of them as 3 cycles of 5 burdens. The first one, this is his prophecy of the stuff that's going to happen in short order. So most of this is going to happen in the next 20 years or so. You're going to know about it. And so we know the players. We know who they are. Babylon, Philistia, Moab, Damascus, Egypt. None of those are strange to Isaiah's audience. They all make sense. It's good to know God's going to judge those guys because they have made it hard on us. But now when you get to chapter 21, now he's saying it's more cloaked. Now we have the burden of the desert or the wilderness by the sea. The oracle concerning the wilderness, the ESV says of, but my colleagues at Southern the Hebrew scholars, by the way, there's a great book you ought to get by Peter Gentry, who tells me that the word there should be by the sea, not of the sea. And it's a book called How to Read and Understand the Biblical Prophets. And it's not a big, thick book, and it's really readable. And Peter Gentry, my dear friend, I've taught with him now. He's been at Southern about 19 or 20 years. So I got there a year or two before him, but he's just brilliant. And he's an Old Testament, and actually he's equally proficient in Greek and Hebrew. This guy's forgotten more than I'll ever know. He's just a brilliant man. And you could get that book, and it would help you not only with Isaiah, but all of the Old Testament prophets, just how you read and understand them. And so it's from Peter that I get the notion of these are divided up in groups of 5. So the first 5 are contemporary players in Isaiah's day, but the next 5, he uses different descriptions. We sort of recognize who they are. Isaiah reveals it, but it's not just, he doesn't just say, oh, this is Babylon. He calls it the desert by the sea. And he pictures this desolate land, and yet it's by the sea. And how he's going to thresh and winnow, like separating the wheat from the chaff. He uses all these poetic images. Then in verse 11 and 12 of 21, it's the burden of Dumah. And Dumah means, it's a word play. It's the word for silence, the burden of silence. Well, where is that? Well, he says, one is calling to me from Seir. Now, Seir is one of the cities of Edom. These were the descendants of Esau. So they're Semitic people. Remember, Jacob and Esau, brothers. But the Jews come through Jacob, and the Edomites, they're Esau. And the Edomites had historically been enemies of Israel. And God says, okay, now in the future, I'm going to wipe you out. And I'm going to deal with Edom. But he doesn't call them Edom. He calls them Dumah, the burden of silence. And he uses the image of a watchman calling out. And then verses 13 through 17, the burden of Arabia. Now, the word he uses here is a word play for the word evening. Now, look what Isaiah's done. He started out with 5 nations that everybody would know, but now he's talking about the wilderness by the sea and silence and evening. And, well, who's this? And he talks about in thickets in Arabia you will lodge. In the evening you will lodge, O caravans of Dedanites. And he's going to destroy them. In chapter 22, verse 1, now he talks about the valley of vision. Where on earth is the valley of vision? What do you mean that you've gone up, all of you, to the housetops? You who are full of shoutings, tumultuous city, exultant town. What town is he talking about? Well, as he goes on, it becomes clear he's talking about Jerusalem. And we're told how God is going to sit in the valley of Jehoshaphat and judge the nations, and he's going to separate the sheep from the goats. Where's that? And that's Jerusalem. And so here you have similar language, but it's talking about, he calls it the valley of vision. And look, he's talking about the day of the Lord in verse 12. In that day, the Lord God of hosts called for weeping and mourning, for baldness and wearing sackcloth, so to shave your heads in repentance. Verse 20, in that day I'll call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe. And look at verse 22. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and none shall shut. Well, if you remember that phrase from the book of Revelation, letters to the 7 churches, and Jesus holds the keys, and he opens and no man can shut. He closes and no man can open. Verse 25, in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, the peg that was fastened in a secure place will give way. So what you trusted in to support and hold you, it's going to be destroyed. So the burden of the valley of vision. And then chapter 23 is the burden of Tyre. And this is like the ships of Tarshish, the seagoing people. Now, they weren't really a threat to Israel so much right then. And so, again, this is Isaiah is looking a little bit down the road. Think of it like this. Let's say that you are linguistically trained in the tribal languages of Papua New Guinea. And you go to Papua New Guinea and you live among the tribal people and you speak their language, and you're trying to come up with a written alphabet for them, right? And so one day you open up your MacBook Pro and you're putting in there the data you've gathered about their language, and one of the tribesmen sees you and they come over and they say, what's that? Now, how do you describe to them your computer? What do you tell them about it? Do you explain to them bits and bytes and binary code? What would you do? Or would you compare it to like a place maybe where they have written things on the wall and recorded things for future generations? I mean, what you would do, you would seize upon images that they're familiar with to say, well, it's like that. It's like that. You can't, it's not going to do you any good or them any good for you to be explaining it to them in terms of binary code and bits and bytes and writing on a hard drive and gigabytes and all that. They don't have a vocabulary for that or an understanding of that. If you just want to explain to them what it is you're doing on that computer, you're going to use something from their culture and say, it's like that. And that is what Isaiah is doing as he's looking into the future at how God is going to judge the nations. Sometimes, he says, in a very short order, God's going to judge Babylon and Philistia and Moab and Damascus and Egypt. But on down the road, he's going to judge these other places that you know them. But I'm not talking about this immediate judgment. I'm talking about the desert by the sea, silence, evening, the valley of vision, Tyre. And then we get to a third cycle, beginning in chapter 24, down in verse 21. You have, now this is the book of general judgment, and we'll look at it a little bit more closely next week, but I want you to see the cycle here. In verse 21, he talks about the city of the wasteland, a desolate city. In chapter 24 and verse 21, he talks about Zion's king. In chapter 25, beginning with verse 1, he talks about the great banquet. Look how it begins. Oh God, you're my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name. And here he talks about how God is going to swallow up death forever, this great banquet. In chapter 26, verse 1, we have beginning a description of the city of God. This song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. He sets up salvation. And then in chapter 27, there's a picture of the final gathering, the redemption of Israel. So what I want you to get here is to see, what I'm sort of showing you is the literary structure of what Isaiah is doing. 15 different prophecies here, 3 cycles of 5. The first 5, here are the players. Here's what God's going to do in the next 20 years or so. Oh, okay, we understand it. We get who these players are. Some of this is surprising to us, but good to know we understand this. Okay, the next 5 is a little further down the road. Here's what God's going to do, and uses these strange descriptors like night and silence and the valley of vision and the desert by the sea. Tyre is one thing that they would know there. So, but the point is that he's saying this is further down. And then the final cycle of 5, these are prophecies of God's redemption, how God is going to work through the wasteland. So through destroying the old, he's going to rebuild Zion's king, the great banquet, the city of God, the final gathering. So Isaiah is now looking way down the road, and he's showing them that beyond the judgment of God, there's the restoration, the reconciliation of God. And so as you read it, get that in your head, understand this biblical prophetic perspective. Remember how I've told you it's like looking at mountain peaks in the distance. You see the peaks, you don't always know which one is in front of the other. It's hard to get the depth. And that's the way Isaiah is prophesying. He's looking into the future, and he's seeing these different events, but there's nothing in the text that tells us one is going to happen 800 years before the other. But that's the way it is. So this is Isaiah's burden, and what he's doing. The pace is picking up. He's really talking about the judgment of God, but he's still giving us glimpses that through the judgment, God's restoration is coming. God's going to have a new heaven and a new earth, and so we've got a few more chapters to go before we get into the comfort portion there at the end. But I think this gives you sort of a good overview of these middle chapters of Isaiah and these oracles against the nations. All right. Here's what, if you get nothing else, get this. God is orchestrating all the events of human history to bring it to a consummation in Jesus Christ. And that's what Isaiah is telling us. That's the message Isaiah is giving to God's people. And he's using this little land, this little nation of Israel, he's using them. Remember the shadows on the wall? We look at Israel, we see the shadow, but the big picture, the real thing, is that God's conquering the whole world. It's about him claiming the world for himself. And he's showing us that as he deals with Israel. All right? Thank you for being in here today. I know this is dense, a lot of scripture, a lot of theology and all that, but thanks for hanging with me. And we'll, in the service to come here, we're only looking at 4 verses, so it won't be quite as much territory there. So thanks for sticking with me in here. We'll see you in a few minutes.